So this panel is going to be moderated by the Chief Executive of the Wellington City Council, Kevin Lavery, and we will welcome back the Honourable Shane Jones, Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development, and Sir Howard Bernstein, the former Chief Executive of the Manchester City Council, and joining them will be the Honourable Patricia Forsyth AM, the Australian High Commissioner to New Zealand. So, how could city deals work here? Would they work here? And what would be the critical factors to determine their success? I will hand you over now to Kevin Lavery.
Nice to meet you, Minister. They're the ones we approve. I think you're in the middle, Minister.
Right, okay. Oh, target practice.
Morena, everyone. Pleasure to be here. We've got 30 minutes, and I think we need to get straight onto it. So I'll start off with Sir Howard. In the UK, Whitehall usually knows best and tells local authorities what to do, and Conservative governments don't normally work with a group of largely Labour councils. How did you bring those two together?
I think there were two influences. Influence number one, that George Osborne, the Chancellor, was also a local Conservative MP, and therefore he was very familiar with many of the challenges.
Mike.
Yeah, sorry. There were two influences, sorry. The first was George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, was the nearest thing we had to a Conservative MP in our area. So he was therefore pretty familiar with the challenges, pretty familiar with our strategy, our ambitions. But I think the most crucial influence on the need for change is that when I gave the timeline in my presentation about some of the changes that had been introduced post 2010, then all of that, of course, was in the aftermath of the crash, in the aftermath of the austerity programme, the requirement placed by government to reduce the national deficit. And what we were able to show was that notwithstanding all the cuts in local government spend and other discretionary spend locally, in Greater Manchester, the public sector was spending as much in 2009 than it was in 2005. So we weren't cutting the deficit in Greater Manchester. And unless we started to do things differently, then very, very clearly we were in a position which financially was unsustainable.
Thanks, Howard. Patricia, the federal government have been investing a lot of energy and money in city deals. Why?
Why? It's a good question. Thanks, Kevin. Is that picking up? Thank you. Well, I think most people would know that the Australian governance system is complex, and at federal government level, we have not always been engaged with cities. There's not always been a strong urban policy. But as been made a couple of times this morning, across the world, the role and place of cities as the key economic drivers in countries is now much better understood. And I think it's been an evolution for Australia. Certainly, we've had cities policies in the past, but in the earlier 2000s, we moved to Infrastructure Australia as a concept by which each of the states could come forward with infrastructure projects, recognising the importance of infrastructure. But in many cases, they were a shopping list of ideas and not necessarily a coordinated approach, not necessarily without the sort of bigger picture, the master planning that you might need to get the best outcomes. So the government moved towards a cities policy, and I have to say it was driven as much from the campaigning of the private sector. The Property Council of Australia particularly looked at Manchester and the city deal on the way through, but a real sense that into the future the role of state, local and federal needed to come together. Of course, with federal and big infrastructure projects, the dollars that come from federal government becomes important. But unless you can translate that down to the local level so that local plans will work with and coordinate with the needs of that infrastructure, then none of it will work successfully. So master planning, doing better at a coordinated approach, became the basis by which we started to see a city deal. And remember, the notion of a deal is a deal. It's a contract, it's an MOU, it's a coming together of the tiers of government, and everybody had to sign up to their part of it. And this is probably what has been different from us than where we've been in the past, not just one tier of government coming up with some ideas. And so, and I think Matt said something about this earlier, those city deals vary. It is very much horses for courses. And in the case of the most sophisticated is around the new Western Sydney airport, and that's 8 local councils plus the state government and the federal government. To the other level, you've got places like Geelong, which is a city in transformation, a major manufacturing city in the 60s, 70s, and then has shifted. And today you're starting to see it as one known more for its university or some of the work it's been doing around its port than and its tourism than a manufacturing city. So adjusting for a city in transition. And we've looked at each of them. There's no one simple answer, but it's a deal. It's 3 tiers of government, and there has to be agreed outcomes. So, and I'll move from my point, but you can't, for example, suggest you're going to have a major piece of infrastructure, be it a new sporting stadium or another major tourist entity, a convention centre, if around it the policies, the local plans don't provide for enough hotel beds or other piece of accommodation, or if the transport links don't work. So you have to start to see these holistically, and that's the difference. That's where we've got to in Australia, perhaps from where we haven't been in the past.
Okay, let's move on to Matt. Thanks, Patricia. A monster deal, 12 jurisdictions, I think you mentioned, 3.5 million people moving to north of 5, similar size to New Zealand as a whole, 20 years. We've seen in Manchester how people like Howard have moved on and others have followed, and one of the reasons for that is governance change. How are you going to embed that over the next 20 years to make sure that you can cope with the changes in premiers and mayors and even chief executives?
I think that's a really great question, and I think it points to one of the real values of a city deal. I mean, if they're done well, they will endure, and that in many ways has to become the measure of success at its most basic, because one of the challenges, and I think certainly in an Australian context, anybody dealing in the Australian infrastructure market will know that one of the challenges in recent years in some jurisdictions has been a variety of changes depending on which side are in government as to which projects are proceeding. Now, no process is going to entirely remove political decision making around infrastructure. That's not going to happen, and indeed nor should it. The democratic process is fundamental. But bringing all of the parties together and agreeing up front a shared vision and a shared set of objectives, which really is critical to the success of a city deal, is fundamental. And as Patricia touched on, it's something that we've never really done before on a tripartite basis in Australia, and that's what makes city deals different. And it's also therefore what, to me, holds out the prospect that we can build enduring documents. And in the case of South East Queensland, where we are certainly pursuing a fairly ambitious agenda, we have very similar dynamics to what Sir Howard has described in Manchester, where we have a Conservative central government, we have a Labor state government, and we have mayors from a variety of backgrounds, led by the Brisbane Mayor as the chairman of the Council of Mayors, who himself comes from a Conservative background as well. So being able to bring all sides together to articulate a set of shared objectives, lock into them, really holds out the prospect of building something that is enduring, something that is lasting, and something that will survive political cycles because it will have buy-in from across the views and the spectrum.
Minister Jones, New Zealand has got the image of New Zealand as clean and green and pure, but 86% of us live in towns and cities, and 60% of us live in 3 metro areas. Is this city deal approach relevant to New Zealand?
Yeah, I think it is. At a very modest level, when we set up the Provincial Growth Fund after the formation of the government, we actually took on board the thinking and some of the decisions that had been made by Stephen Joyce. And I sort of feel, because our electoral cycles are so short, that a politician like me, I have to be quite pragmatic. So a number of the projects that have already been invested in, they were projects that were developed by regional stakeholders over the last 6 years. I think they were taken by surprise that the new government came into being, and 1% of GDP in rough terms, 3 billion, 1% of 300 billion of our economy is a significant fiscal impulse. Naturally, I have ambitions that there'll be many ribbons to cut next year, but that's another matter. So I would build on those small successes. Obviously, our city-state is Auckland, and in fairness to Phil Twyford and the transport officials who I know are in the room, they have negotiated a compact for transport purposes, but you're never going to strip politics out, unfortunately, a lot of these debates. So you have to start early and identify what roadblocks might be in the way. So a small stepping stone, I would say, in terms of Auckland transport, although one needs to understand hieroglyphics to quite understand what they're doing, and I'll leave that to NZTA. That is a small case of where there's a basis for, I think, enriching the engagement. In regional New Zealand, given that we're going to face a significant reset in our major export industry, farming, I think that there's going to have to be a closer alliance between central government and regional local government, because much of the economy in those areas, in my view, in the face of climate change and a host of other challenges, they're going through a transition. And they're so important to a country like ours that it cannot be done without a very collaborative approach between central government and regional government. I'm certainly up for that.
And Minister Jones, from a local and regional government perspective, what can we do to build your confidence for you to let go, to help us do more?
A fair bit of it is to do with politics. Like our party, New Zealand First, we campaigned to abstract GST revenue out of central government back into essentially subnational levels of government. That's the reality of negotiating a new government that never saw the light of day. But I do have some sympathy for our local and regional leadership, and I think it's not just about the megaphone personalities of central government. We, I think, have run the race to the point of exhaustion as to how do we find the capital to do a lot of the projects. And we've had a type of thinking that came out of our version of Thatcherism of the late 80s and 90s, and we've become so trapped in that thinking that it takes a lot of imagination, and it's also necessary for regional and local government to bring forward that imagination as to how we can rethink and repackage how we find the money to do these things. And when we get in a clinch, it's important that local and regional government don't hide in the shadows. They need to stand up and get a mandate from their own people, as well as us seeking a mandate. And I think that the longer we talk about these issues without addressing less structure, but what is the new generation of thinking for a small 5 million people economy to find the long-term capital certainty so that the wealth creators can follow. And at the moment, we're missing an action in that regard. That's my personal view.
Thank you. Back to Sir Howard. Everything sounded great, but there have been a number of city deals across the UK. Are there any failures, and what are the lessons from those?
I'm not sure if you could say that they've been failures. I think there's been one notable absentee in the city deal process, notably colleagues in Leeds and Yorkshire, particularly around devolution, where there is still a debate taking place in that area about the form of future governance arrangements. I think the greater likelihood we're going to see in the UK over the next 2 or 3 years, I think change will come in two forms. One, I think there will be more of a commitment to look at greater levels of fiscal devolution. I've been a proponent of the devolution of road taxation, fuel duty taxation to individual areas, because if you think that we've got a rising transport productivity challenge in our big city regions, then it seems to me we've got to start to use that resource in a way which more intelligently represents the value and time and savings which are associated with securing better integration, better through ticketing, and more appropriate investment. I think the other increase we will see is a stronger focus around research and innovation, particularly because of the thing we really don't want to talk about, which we're being told will happen on the 31st of October, where very clearly our international trade and investment patterns will largely relate to our capability to remain a world leader in those sorts of particular areas.
Thank you. Patricia, how do you think, what's the next stage for city deals in Australia?
What's the next stage for them? Well, I think we've got to see them. They're still evolving. I think there'll obviously be lessons from the earliest ones, but and we've seen now move towards some of the regions. I think the important part of all of this is it can't be just about people's pet projects in a local area. These have to be, these are city shaping. We have to look at the interface between infrastructure and the broader goals of the area. And whether it's a 45-minute city, whether in the case of Western Sydney, we're shaping it around, it's being shaped around a 30-minute concept, and that is that the majority of people who will live in this, work in this area around the airport, which has really got high job targets, will live in that area. So it's evolving is to get the statistics right between, if you're creating that number of jobs, what's the housing mix to do all that. And so there's a lot of research that will go with that. It's evolving. And these deals are variously, there's a couple at 5 years, but most of them are at 10, or in the case of the Western Sydney Airport, at 20 years. So I think you can't imagine that what you've put down on paper at the beginning is exactly where it will be at the end. And I think there's a measure of flexibility and evolving. And for example, smart technology is moving at such a pace that some of what we thought would be how we'd shape them may not be where we'll be in a few years' time. And we have to remain open to that. But through all of this, the engagement with the private sector is one of the fundamentals. So we've talked a lot about government and governance today, but the other part of this is that being open to the private sector is a part of the city deals.
Okay. Matt, Southeast Queensland, obviously a huge growth opportunity, but that's a very big state. How are you managing the politics of all those areas who aren't benefiting from this approach?
Well, I think one of the benefits that we've had in Southeast Queensland has been a really mature and significant relationship between the state and local governments around land use planning. And that's something that has really evolved over the last 20 or so years as that growth trajectory has picked up out of necessity, for no other reason than the fact that everybody needed to be pulling in the same direction to manage some of those significant growth factors. And one of the significant things we saw occur over probably around 10 or 15 years ago was a series of local government amalgamations that certainly set up, I think, Southeast Queensland councils to have significant balance sheets significant capabilities, significant focus on both delivery and strategy, so that they could become, I guess, real partners and genuine partners with the state in managing that growth challenge. And so we're now, as I said in my remarks, working with 12 local governments covering 3.5 million people who have very significant balance sheets and themselves can deliver real investment in major projects. For example, we've recently partnered between the federal government, the state government and the Gold Coast City Council to invest in 2 different stages of Gold Coast Light Rail. And the Gold Coast City Council can afford to put hundreds of millions of dollars on the table towards that project because they've got the balance sheet to do it. Same again in Moreton Bay, which is just to the north of Brisbane, where they partnered again on a tripartite basis around a heavy rail project. Again, not the traditional domain of local government, but they can do it because they knew that by putting money on the table, they'd incentivise the other levels of government to come to the table to help realise some of their own ambitions. So that relationship has evolved in part because of the governance, but in part too because we set out 20 years ago to bring in a statutory regional plan, and the state at the time recognised local government had to be at the table because they are the primary level of government that's responsible for land use planning. But we knew as well we couldn't manage the growth challenge local government area by local government area. We had to take an integrated approach because we operate as one region. So those regional plans and the cooperation we've had to do around that has put us in a really good place where there is a great and strong relationship. It's not always easy, but a strong relationship and a mature relationship between state and local government. And we're now taking that partnership to the next level through the city deal by working with the Commonwealth on some of those same challenges as well. So it's been a real evolution over time that's kind of built on the foundations that we've had, so that we've been able to evolve a model that is going to work for us.
Thank you. Shane, I wonder, they're touching on funding and finance. If we're going to transform the economy, we need to invest. To invest, we need money to do that. You mentioned earlier the need to move beyond the sort of pay-as-you-go model for NZTA's investment. There's talk of value capture and other types of levies. What's your view on funding and financing tools?
Well, I'm hoping that it's a very good question. So we've backed a body of work. In fact, I'm not entirely sure where it's up to. I'll talk to Simon Allen. He's meant to be helping the government solve the problem rather than sipping wine down in Queenstown. But basically, what we decided when we came in as a government was to fund infrastructure with different models. Now, that body of work is well and truly on its way. Cabinet has addressed it, and we're backing the Minister of Transport with that. I feel that the funding infrastructure dimension, without the creation of the Uber Authority, you know what I mean, in New Zealand we're setting up essentially a mega authority that will eclipse the powers of local and regional government to get projects underway rather than stymied at the level of, if not NIMBYism, then the under-resourced councils. So 2 things are happening over the last couple of years. The creation of a mega authority with substantial powers, the development of new funding models, but I'd like to think that we are moving as a country from the predictable and quite tedious debates about everything has to be private, nothing can be private, everything has to be public, nothing can be public. And to win those debates as infrastructure people, you need to work with both your local but in your central government politicians so we can take the country with us. And I know I may sound a tad trite in saying that, but the last thing the infrastructure industry needs in New Zealand, and obviously we're going to look carefully at Dr. Bollard and the new people in that regard, come up with ideas that we can sway the minds and hearts of New Zealanders that we have to go into new territory and then create that mandate. And I think the mechanisms are relatively simple. I think where the risk lies is it's like politics and economics. Do you have the leadership? Do you have the mandate? And are you remotely capable of executing it? And we've got a very, wasn't going like that, by the way. Those 3 things. So I feel that we've got the leadership. On the question of capital, the mandate's almost there, and the execution ability lies out there. But there are obviously better ways to execute our projects by working more collaboratively, but give the capital certainty so the investors can follow, the tertiary, secondary entrepreneurialism waves can follow, the 30-year, 20-year plan, but a short to medium-term capital certainty. And I think that in that way will transform the company, both your companies, but also the country. So that's about all I've got to say. Dr. Bollard, your team of people, you're not allowed to go away. I've just been told by the Prime Minister's Department I have to have a photo with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane. We're coming to the end of the session, so let's wrap up. Let's imagine you've got to join Jacinda Ardern in the elevator. You've got a couple of floors to make your pitch. Should New Zealand adopt the city deal approach or not? And what would your advice be? And it's only a few floors. I'll start with Matt.
I'm always reluctant, particularly as a public servant, to come across the ditch and tell New Zealand how to do their business. You'll ultimately adopt the model that works for you, but I think more than anything else, there is a lot of value to be derived from greater collaboration between the levels of government. City deals are a great platform for that. Whether that's the New Zealand model will obviously be a matter for you guys in the discussions that follow, but certainly it is a tool that is unlocking value in Australia, and obviously Sir Howard's talked about how it's unlocking value in the UK as well.
Kevin, I was going to start where Matt was, and that is an Australian telling a New Zealanders what to do doesn't always go down a treat. But for what it's worth, look, we've obviously, the value of cities is something that we've grasped as part of this policy. And listening to, where Manchester's been on this journey for a long time, you can see the benefits. I think the starting point is to help communities understand about there is infrastructure deficits in most countries, what that means, and it's usually about growth and change, and you have to get communities to understand that the change is happening and help them see the benefits of growth. The hardest thing is managing that change. As the underpinning then of that message about from local upwards, the concept of a city deal is really much about hearing a local perspective in shaping what will probably come with funding from, if you like, a higher levels. And that's the key part of it that should make it work, hearing the local message as part of it.
Thanks, Patricia. Shane, yes, no, or maybe?
Rotorua has been the handsome beneficiary of central government provincial growth funding to beautify and improve the infrastructure of Rotorua. So at a modest level, obviously it's already happening. Jacinda, hello. You no doubt will be talking to me and Winston after the next election. Have I got a deal for you?
Very quickly. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all approach around city deals for everywhere. I think the similarity actually between Queensland and Manchester is actually quite remarkable. I'm very impressed with that. I think there's 2 points I would make. First, I think local people, local authorities have to challenge themselves about whether or not they are competent and trusted partners with business, whether or not they've got the structures in place themselves to be active partners working with business. We were not in that position, as you well know, Kevin, 20 years ago. We are now. That was a very powerful influence on government. And secondly, this is not or shouldn't be just about money, as Matt actually rightly indicated in his presentation. Yes, part of it will inevitably be about money, but it should also be how you align policies, how you align priorities, and more particularly, get the best value for what you currently spend.
Thank you. I've just had a message from Jacinda. She's up for it, which means we're going to have to do it. And of course, execution's a lot tougher than an idea. As a great American president once said, well done is better than well said. And can you just show your appreciation? That was George Washington, by the way. Show your appreciation for the panel. Thank you.